as I was reading your book, I noticed that you did, I think in your first chapter, after the introductory chapter, you talked about five different types of apologetics. I think there's the classic apologetics approach. I think William Lane Craig is very, very well known in Christian circles for this approach. Was this started by like Anselm, I think, or maybe he was the father, I think, of classic apologetics?
I wouldn't say that. I know that Aquinas is, I guess you could say, the foremost proponent of the cosmological argument. But then even that was built off of Aristotle. So classical apologetics even predates Christianity itself. It's just Christianity co-opted some of the arguments. And so the cosmological argument, I would say, was perfected by Aquinas. And then Anselm is the one who gives us the ontological argument. So usually what happens within the realm of classical apologetics, you have the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, which usually I would say is closer to the Enlightenment era, and then you have the ontological argument that goes back to that goes back to Anselm. And so all those guys are related to it, but to say that Anselm started it, I'm not entirely sure on that.
All right. No, I was just wondering. I'm gonna get schooled today. There's a next one, evidentialism. I think this one's actually pretty popular. I think Christians unknowingly do this one naturally, without really thinking about the evidentialist perspective. I think they just kind of do it just because I think they're trained to do it. In most Christian circles, do you know, or can you give a small definition of the evidentialist?
Yeah, evidentialism is the attempt to prove Christianity true by an inductive case built on evidence. And so the most classic version of this would be, I would say, Gary Habermas's argument for the resurrection of Christ. You know, he starts with 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and then just goes through all the historical evidence and historical arguments that you could find there. I'd say Lee Strobel does the same thing in his book, A Case for Christ. And what you do is you start from the bottom up and you build this case based on evidence to lead one to the, I guess you could say, the greater probability that Christianity is true based on that evidence. And so the Enlightenment, so the Enlightenment for the most part repudiated classical apologetics. And so evidential apologetics, I think, was the answer to that. You know, so how, using the Enlightenment man's presuppositions, how can we, refute them on their own presuppositions or own assumptions? And so that's what evidentialism's all about.
Got it. Okay. Another one was the cumulative case. I'm not familiar. This is the first time I've ever heard of the cumulative case. What is the cumulative case method?
So cumulative case apologetics is the idea that you're going to kind of mix and match a number of different tests. So if you just make a historical argument, that's great. But on its own, it might not be persuasive. And so what about a scientific argument? What about a psychological argument? What about a philosophical argument? So it actually tries to combine the best of these, but it's still evidential when it comes down to it. And so their analogy, the proponents of it, would be like every form or every apologetic argument is a bucket that has a leaky hole in it. But if you take 10 different buckets with a hole in it and you stack them together, they kind of cover each other's hole, and you end up with a more foolproof apologetic.
Got it. Okay. Another one that I've never heard of was reformed epistemology. Pretty fancy words. Epistemology, isn't that the study of how things come to be or come to exist, or what is epistemology?
So epistemology is, by definition, is the study of knowledge. Okay. Specifically, it asks and answers the question of how do we know what we know? On what basis do we know it? And so reformed epistemology as an apologetic really is just a negative apologetic. And what I mean by that is apologetics have a negative and positive component usually. The negative component shoots down the other position. The positive component builds up our position. Reformed epistemology really doesn't try to make an argument for Christianity. It simply tries to justify Christianity by showing that everybody has faith. So the most hardcore atheists will come to you and say, hey, you guys base what you believe on faith. We don't. We base it on facts. But then you could ask a series of questions to prove to them that that's not true. For example, I could ask an atheist, how do you know Paraguay is real? If you have not been there, then they'd say, well, because I've seen it in a geography book. And so then I could come back and say, okay, so you're trusting a book written by men, and you just happen to deem that book to be authoritative. So you trust that there really is a Paraguay, but you haven't verified it yourself. And so on the same token that they try to knock us for having a blind faith and trusting authority, actually, everybody does this. And so we are built to trust things on authority, and all humans do it. Yeah. So all Reformed epistemology does is point that out. But then they don't really go from there. And so it's not satisfactory because of that.
So the earth is flat. No, I'm just kidding.